You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, we've got some bad news for a top Trump official. Can you explain what just happened here and what we can expect to see tomorrow?
Brian, the Supreme Court just refused to put a stop to Steve Bannon having to report to the Federal Bureau of Prisons to officially become an inmate, to serve his 4-month sentence. So Monday morning, July 1st, Steve Bannon will report to a BOP facility, and he will officially become an inmate.
Now, was there any hope that his effort to appeal to the Supreme Court was going to be successful? I mean, the Supreme Court is there basically to deal with issues that no other court in the entire country can deal with. It's there to distinguish between discrepancies in different circuits, like circuit splits. So why did Steve Bannon think that his relatively straightforward appeal of a contempt charge was going to be successful?
You know, I guess hope springs eternal, but it feels like the only one who had any hope of avoiding the commencement of his prison term was Steve Bannon. When you realize that the Intermediate Appellate Court, the D.C. Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, turned down the request to stay the commencement of his period of incarceration. Of course, he ran to the Supreme Court, maybe hoping against hope that the radical right-wing bloc, the justices that Donald Trump, talks about as if he still owns, might see things his way, but they summarily, without comment, and apparently unanimously, because there was no noted dissent, said, Steve, nope, you go ahead and start your 4-month prison term. And what was that for? It was for being convicted by a jury of his peers on 2 criminal counts of contempt of Congress. He got 2 subpoenas, one for testimony and one for documents from the January 6th House Select Committee. And what were they looking for, Brian? They were looking for evidence that could incriminate Donald Trump in the insurrection. Steve Bannon said, I'm not even going to show up and try to claim I have some privilege that would prevent me from having to comply with these subpoenas. I'm just going to blow them off. And that is the crime of contempt of Congress times 2, because there were 2 subpoenas. Remember, Peter the Green Bay Sweep Navarro committed identical crimes, went to trial, was convicted in a D.C. minute, was sentenced to 4 months. He is presently incarcerated, serving his 4-month term, and now Steve Bannon will join him as a fellow inmate. Don't know if they'll be cellmates, don't even know if they'll be at the same Federal Bureau of Prisons facility. But you know what? It feels like accountability has been very long in the making for guys like Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro, but now it's beginning to creep up.
Well, his term is going to be a 4-month term. Do you think he'll serve the entirety of it?
So the way the Federal Bureau of Prisons works and the federal criminal justice system generally is he'll be required to serve at least 85% of that 4 months. Often what happens is confinement facilities, jails, prisons will dangle what we call good time credits in front of inmates. And I actually think that it's smart. Why? Because if you can try to incentivize an inmate, to follow the rules, to, not engage in misconduct, to not shank fellow inmates by dangling good time credit in front of them, if they serve their sentence without any infractions, then they can earn a little bit of credit on their sentencing. I think that's an important tool to sort of help protect and promote good order and discipline in the prison system, which I can tell you, I've been inside more jails, detention facilities, and prisons than I could ever count up, and that's both federal and local, both military and civilian, and they can be very difficult places, not only for the administration of the facility to control, but it can be difficult doing time for the inmates themselves. So he'll probably end, that's a long-winded way of saying he'll probably end up doing at least 85% of that 4 months. But Brian, really, I shouldn't have buried the lead, because once he gets out, guess what? He gets prosecuted all over again by the state of New York. Why? Because he's been indicted for defrauding Trump supporters out of their money by creating a fictitious We Build the Wall Foundation. Yeah. Now, our viewers may recall, Brian, Steve Bannon was indicted federally for those same crimes. Think about it, defrauding Donald Trump's supporters. And Donald Trump was so concerned that his supporters had been mistreated by Steve Bannon that he pardoned Steve Bannon for his crimes. The good news is the state of New York, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, said, not so fast, Steve. You violated New York state law, not just federal law, so we will be prosecuting you. So the good news is this may only be the first of multiple prison terms for Steve Bannon.
Glenn, why is the venue for the upcoming Manhattan DA prosecution for defrauding Trump's own supporters, why is the venue Manhattan?
I assume because that's where he doesn't have to live there, but he was apparently doing business there. And as part of his scheme to defraud these Trump supporters, some of the crimes must have been committed in the state of New York, which is what gives them jurisdiction over those crimes.
Okay. Now, very notably, the Republicans in Congress, House Republicans, actually tried to intervene to protect Steve Bannon. Can you talk about their scheme with regard to invalidating the entirety of the January 6th committee?
You know, it feels like at every turn, under the leadership of House Speaker MAGA Mike Johnson, the Republicans in Congress are willing to abuse their power, their authority, their position to try to, and I'm going to use this term advisedly, obstruct justice, to try to help Donald Trump and his criminal associates, try to wiggle out from underneath their federal investigations, their federal prosecutions, their state investigations and prosecutions. That is really more than just a gross abuse of power by Republican members of Congress. I contend it should be investigated as a potential obstruction of justice crime. Just as if you were selling your vote for, your own personal benefit. This feels akin to that. It's a gross abuse of power that seems to perhaps bleed over into the criminal, obstructing justice for Steve Bannon, for Donald Trump, and for others. And at some point, Brian, I just wish the rule of law would rise up and fully assert itself to put a stop to this and to deter others from continuing to abuse their power and potentially commit crimes. But, right now the rule of law seems to be sort of lagging behind, if not hibernating entirely, when it comes to members of Congress who committed crimes. I don't want to go off track here, but remember, we have members of Congress who are still serving, who asked for presidential pardons for what they did on January 6th. They knew they'd committed crimes on and around January 6th. They didn't want to be held accountable for those crimes. They wanted to get away with them, so they asked Donald Trump to pardon them for their crimes. That's a confession of guilt. Don't take it from me. Take it from the Supreme Court in 1915, when the Supreme Court said a pardon carries with it an imputation of guilt, and accepting a pardon is some confession of guilt. So that now brings us back to Steve Bannon, because a really interesting twist in the New York State prosecution of Steve Bannon will the prosecutors try to use Bannon's pardon from Donald Trump for the same crimes, even though they were brought federally and now they're being prosecuted in the state court? Will they try to introduce his accepting of a pardon for those crimes as evidence of consciousness of guilt, or as evidence of what we call an admission by a party opponent, and show it to the jury? And boy, if they do, feels like that will all but seal the deal with respect to Steve Bannon being held guilty in that New York case.
Yeah, it's just one more instance where Donald Trump and his lackeys' efforts to evade accountability will ultimately come back to bite them in the ass in the end. So we will, of course, stay on top of this. In the meantime, a big welcome from the Legal Breakdown community for Steve Bannon as he heads over to prison tomorrow. With that said, for those watching right now, if you want to stay on top of all the prosecutions that Trump and his lackeys are contending with right now, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.